of the show before you worked on it? I know you started around 2000, right, with the original series. Were you a
Yeah,
fan of the show when you started working for it?
that's a good question. I was going to school in New York at the time the show began, and living in New York, you just don't watch a lot of TV. I was fully aware of the show because it was in the zeitgeist, and I remember, in fact, when I moved out here, I lived in an apartment area that had kind of a courtyard, and someone would always have their television set to the X-Files when it would come on, and so across the courtyard, I would hear, Mark Snow's the whistling part of it at the beginning, the do do do, that carried really well across the courtyard, and so I always could set my watch by hearing that. But my background was I came out to write and direct, and I took a job in film development, started as an intern, worked my way up to story editor at different companies in production, and I wanted to work for a creative type. And a mutual friend knew of the opening at 1013 and got me in for an interview. I first met with the vice president of the company, Mary Astadorian, and then they brought me back for a second interview with Chris. And I, at that point, went and watched the X-Files movie on video just so I would have a primer. And again, I was familiar with Mulder and Scully and
Right, right.
extraterrestrials and all that because you couldn't avoid it. But no, honestly, I hadn't spent much time watching the show. And I remember it actually may have served me well because in the second interview, they had another candidate in the lobby with me. And she had on a button that said, "I heart the X-Files."
Oh,
And I think that probably killed her chances just as soon as she walked in the room. I, in fact, didn't ask any questions about the show. I probably talked a little bit more about myself and what I was interested in than I should have in a job interview. Um, but so I was a little surprised when I got the call that Chris liked me and brought me on. But I think part of it had to do with I wasn't asking where's the show going in this season, and what's the background of Mulder and Scully and things like that. So I quickly gained an appreciation and love of it. But yeah, so I started about middle of season 7, and I think it was around the time of X Cops, maybe.
yeah, great. I love that
When that came
episode.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't hear anybody talk about that much, but I thought that was Vince Gilligan, I believe, and just kind of different take on the show.
Well, you kind of started my next question about how you became involved in the show. Now, when you were hired, did you what was the first position? Were you assistant? Were you a story editor? Where did you begin on that rung?
So I started as Chris's assistant,
Okay.
which is if you're going to be an assistant, being the showrunner's assistant is a phenomenal position
Yeah.
because there are so many, as you know, there's so many people on the show taking care of all the details that you can just kind of, handle your person. And I remember, for example, he would need to change production meetings at the last minute for whatever reason. And, I don't know, 100, 200 people may show up at a production meeting. And with one phone call, I could just be like to the production office, "Hey, sorry to do this to you, but we're going to need to move that 4 o'clock meeting to 7:30 if we could." And it wasn't my problem. So I started with him there, and then I was with him for middle of season 7 through the end of the show. Then I stayed with him for 2 or 3 more years after that, outside of the show. And then with the writing partner I had at the time, we set up a couple TV pilots and parted ways at that time to pursue the pilots. And he always left the door open in case that didn't work out. And then around, I guess it was maybe 2014 was when he did the After at Amazon, the pilot. And he brought me on to the show as a staff writer for that. And unfortunately, that show didn't proceed further than the pilot, but we boarded out the whole season of 8 episodes. And then when the most recent X-Files season, I guess season 11, he brought me on as a staff writer for that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And you were there through season 11, right? You were the staff writer through season 11, right?
Yeah.
What was it like to work for a show back in 2000? What was it like coming to work with a show for a show with such a history as the X-Files?
It was remarkable because, again, I wasn't thoroughly versed in it, familiar with it on the surface level. And, I would get the fan mail because back then people still wrote letters. And, it was just sort of the beginning of the internet sites that you could check in on the fan feedback. But, we had pictures in our break room of people who had tattoos of the X-Files on their body. And, we'd get kind of a few strange calls from people trying to get aggressively through to Chris, and again, the mail and, the merchandising and the spin-off shows and the syndication and the movies. And I knew at the time this is a remarkable show. There's not much out there that generates so much for its main show, but then spinoffs and other properties. So it was, and then I think at the time DVDs were just starting to come into being. And before that, you'd have Laserdiscs, and they might release maybe 4 episodes of a season in a set. But with DVDs, you could release the entire season, and the X-Files just dominated in that area, I think, and that was a big thing. But it was fun. At my desk in the office, I had access to all the swag was in the cabinet behind me, and I was sort of the dispenser of the swag. It was nice too. We'd get a lot of charities would reach out to us if we could have signed scripts that they could have, so to be able to do nice things like that for people was always cool. And one of my favorite things too was giving set tours. To work somewhere that you give tours of your job, and so that allowed me to go onto the set, whatever I had a tour to give. It would just be a couple few people probably, and to see their excitement, helped me be excited too. I remember one point, in fact, it was my own landlord and his wife. They were huge fans, uncomfortable type of people that didn't know the boundaries on the set. They didn't know how to respect the boundaries. And at one point, I think it was Vince directing maybe, but David Duchovny was off to the side, just preparing for the scene and whatnot. And they kind of got away from me and just went right to David. And we're telling him how they named their goldfish Mulder and Scully, and they were so excited. I was just mortified and trying to reel them back in. I can understand their enthusiasm. I've had enthusiasm for shows like that myself, but I remember one of the scariest was Chris went up to UC Santa Barbara to speak in the theater there, and maybe 600 people in the audience, or 600 or 800, and at the end, he signed some autographs on stage, and the fans lined up in a line across the side of the stage and up the aisle. And at a certain point, one of the people overseeing it decided to just give Chris a break and cut the line at a point and say, like, no one beyond this point is going to get anything. So Chris was he didn't know about it. He was just dutifully signing things, and the line diminished. And the people that they had turned away started sitting in the theater just to watch. And when he got to the last person, he was like, that's it? And the people in the audience were like, no, we want your autograph too. And he's like, well, come on up. And they literally just charged the stage. They didn't take the side aisle. They just charged at the stage. It was,
Can you, because I understand the difference, but for the audience, can you explain, like in a writer's room? And I understand from when we spoke to Ben Van Allen, he was explaining it's a little different dealing with the X-Files. What is it like in a writer's room? What's a staff writer versus somebody who's actually writing the episode?
Well, in my experience on the X-Files, you would start with breaking on the board, and you'd have a 3x5 cork board with 3x5 inch note cards, I think, and you'd fill that up. And you would work with the team to break the story. And then once, at the time, Frank Spotnitz was running the writer's room a lot. Once he was satisfied, they would launch whatever writer was handling that script off to do a draft and maybe get feedback. And Chris would often do a polish to put his input on it as well. I don't know if I addressed exactly what you're looking for, but
no, that's what because I'm trying to remember. I didn't spend a lot of time in the writer's room. I did briefly when I had knee surgery. I was in the AD staff and in post-production. So I know how ER storyboarded and broke everything down, but it was more just a general question. Here's a fun question. How did you become named after, or your main character become named after you, first and last name?
Here's a scoop. I'm actually named after him.
How's that possible?
I'm just kidding.
Wait a minute. This is mom brain. I'm actually, wait a minute.
I changed my name. I'm a super fan.
Look at that.
No, it's funny because having come from film development, all I did all the time was read scripts, just so many scripts that I had to read. And when I changed over and worked for Chris, nobody cared about my opinion on scripts. It wasn't part of my job to read the scripts. And so there are so many drafts, so many episodes simultaneously going on. It's really hard to keep up with it if you're not on, the writer's team. And so I kind of pulled back, and I would read maybe the first draft or, one of the drafts along the way. But at one point, Mary Astorin, the vice president that brought me on board, she said to me, I think it'd be good if you read more of the drafts. I think Chris would like it. And I didn't know that he was paying any attention one way or the other. And this was at the beginning of, which season was that? Was that 9 or
8, I think? Well, when
8?
Carrie always came in at 8. I
8.
think.
Okay, so the beginning of
Oh
8.
no, you're right, 9. I'm sorry. That's 9.
9. It's all a blur.
I know.
But so we got the first draft delivered. You know, you had a PA going around handing out the hard
Yep.
copy drafts to everybody, and I got mine. And I think it was first thing in the morning. And where I sat at my desk was about 30 feet from Chris's desk in his office, and we had a direct line of sight. And so he would always just, he was so dedicated. He would park himself in that seat and just start typing, which is remarkable. You know, he wouldn't fiddle around. He would sit down and start typing. And so he's busy doing that. I get a draft and I start going through it. And if I recall, I think the character's introduced in the first few pages, and I kind of chuckled. And Chris immediately called me out on that. He's like, "Oh, what'd you just read?" You know, like he was totally paying attention to me very subtly. And I was like, "Oh, see, my name is in here." And at that point, I didn't know also the extent of the character's involvement. It could have just been a cameo or a walkout
Right.
or something. And come to find out, it's like a recurring special agent on the show, which was great, or assistant director as he was. And Chris quickly was like, "It's a character on the show, but if you don't really want to be named after that character, I can maybe name another character after you." And I was like, "No, of course not." You know, I was super flattered. Whatever you think is best. And it turned out to be a great character. And the fun thing was, then they cast Carrie in the role, which is amazing. Um, and occasionally he would call into the office, and I'd answer, Chris Carter's office. He was like, "This is Brad Follmer calling. Is this Brad Follmer I'm speaking to?" Which was very nice of him to play along. And but it was an honor, of course, to have that happen, and it was very exciting. And it pretty much made me unsearchable on the internet, because there was so much more about him than me. So people have told me that I'm hard to find.
What was your favorite experience being on the show?
It's maybe trite to say, but the family element of it, that people spend 12, 14 hours or more a day together, 5 days a week. And I wasn't even on the set. I was in the development office, but I would go to the set as much as possible, and just being around everybody, and they're working so hard and spending so much time together and at the highest level. And um, just I just remember a lot of respect among everybody. For example, Kim Manners, the director, just a really classy, nice guy. And remarkably, he would remember everybody's name. I would walk on the set like the second time and he'd already know my name, but not just me, but everybody. And it was so impressive, because so much is going on, and he's so busy with things. But Rob Bowman and Vince Gilligan and Frank Spotnitz and Chris, and just the whole group of people. And it was a great environment, great experience.
That's awesome, because you hear so many horror stories, from shows.
Yeah, yeah.
I was lucky in having a great experience too, but I've heard bad stories too.
Yeah, it's understandable. It's not excusable often, but the hours that people were working and the stress that they're under, things come out, unfortunately. But
Yeah,
hopefully they can patch it up.
I have stories. I get good.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to be recorded, but let's just say I've had TMZ call me before. Believe it.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, and not because of me, but because of an experience. Yeah. What was it like working with Chris as a writer? You're a writer. What was it like working with someone as talented as Chris?
He's great because, one, he's very intense. He's very quiet. He's very focused. He actually helped me after the after went down. I told him about a pilot that I was developing, just so that he knew I was going to be busy with something. Hopefully, not inviting him to be a part of it, because I didn't imagine that he would want to be a part of it. But I mentioned it to him, and when the after went down, he said, "Now, when are we getting together about your script?" And yeah, and he came over to my place once a week for several weeks, and sat down on the carpet behind me, and we got out the 3x5 cards with the Sharpie pen, and he was the one writing on the cards. But it was fascinating because it was an idea I'd been kicking around for a while based on real people and real events. So I'd done a lot of research and had general ideas of where to go with it. And I was pitching him my ideas, and he would hone in on things immediately and tell me, 5 scenes later, or 3 episodes later, where the problem was going to be with that. And you could tell that here's a person who is, written or developed hundreds of episodes of TV, and it's just second nature for him to see things coming around the corner before someone such as myself could. And just taking in as much as I could from that experience was great. And he's involved me with several writing projects now. So it's in fact, there's something I'm developing now that we hope to work together on. And he's been great to work with.
Two more questions that we've asked everybody across the board. Why do you think a show like The X-Files is still relevant 25 plus years later?
Well, I think underlying everything is just good drama with good characters, and that holds up. In this day and age, conspiracy theories and governments with ulterior motives is certainly something that taps into what people are interested in. Um, but I do really think if you bore down to it, it's the characters and their relationship. Because I've made that mistake of thinking I had a great idea for a story, and learning quickly that without interesting characters, no, it's only entertaining for a little bit. So I think that's part of it. An interesting thing, when they came back for season 10 after so many years off the air, I met through a mutual friend someone who had kids in maybe junior high, and they had missed the whole first run of the show completely. They were too young, but I think at the time Netflix had the series up, and so the mother, who was my age, was watching the show from the beginning, every episode of, what was it at that point, like 202 episodes, I think.
So
And they were excited for season 10 coming, and they were hoping to finish all the prior season episodes before it came out. So that was something that brought it back and built the excitement. As a side note, if I just throw this out there, which I think is interesting, Chris, according to him, he had pitched the show all around town and was passed everywhere, including Fox. Nobody wanted to pick it up. And I asked him one day, he had something behind his desk that was a page from his daily, his date book of appointments, and he had a page framed. And I asked him what that was, and he was like, "That's the day that I pitched Fox the show." And I think if I get it right, that may have been the pitch when they passed on it. And I said, "Well, then what changed that they ended up obviously picking up the show?" And he said there was an article produced that a poll had been taken of the percentage of people who thought they had had alien experiences or encounters. And it was a startlingly high percentage of the respondents, I think even a majority maybe. And he reapproached Fox with those statistics, I think maybe within a week or two. And that was maybe one of the deciding factors for them to change their mind and see that there was something. So in terms of the longevity, I think, people are interested in what's beyond Earth, and is there life out there? And since it taps into those things in a somewhat vague way that you can leave the door open, I guess that's an enduring element that people are interested in.
that's amazing. That's amazing that something like that just changed television. Really.
Yeah, even Fox passed on. That's you think of the success. Oh, he must have pitched that. They loved it. It was a home run. And if you think of it too, and you'd know better than me probably, since I didn't watch it on the first run at the beginning, but Fox was a fledgling network. They didn't have a lot of shows. They put it on the Friday night slot, which is death to a show, and it stuck it out for a couple seasons, I guess, before they moved it to Sunday night, and then it became a bigger hit.
Yeah. If you could say one thing, or if you could say something to the fans over the last 20 of the X-Files over the last 25 years, what would it be?
Well, I guess thank you for having a great experience and a great job and meeting great people and learning so much and being entertained myself. The appreciation that they were so avid about the show, and I know from seeing the writers at the time that they got so much inspiration from the feedback, and it really, I think, encouraged them to raise their game and to always strive to do something that would be good and well received. And I know sometimes they took some beatings on things. I remember, for example, Tom Schnauz, I think, wrote an episode of the show that was not well received. And we were laughing about this. This is why I can say it, because Tom thought it was funny too. But somebody even wrote, "This must be an alias for the writer, because who would be named Tom Schnauz?" Someone else said it was the second worst episode they'd ever seen, which leads the question of then what was worse.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite episode now, looking back?
I thought about that before this, and there are so many. And there's Darren Aaron Morgan and Vince have written so many classic ones. But I think one of the ones working for Chris that he introduced me to, because I asked him early on, I was like, what are some of the ones I should watch of yours? And Triangle was one that I think he was very proud of. And so I looked at that, and the filmmaker in me, loves what he did with that. And that was just a very different one too. So I think I would say that. Well, there's something that I felt overlooked severely at the time, and this is like a major news story overlooked. That the show spun off into The Lone Gunman, and if you recall, the pilot episode of The Lone Gunman involved flying a plane into the World Trade Center.
Mhm.
And if my timing is right, I believe that aired in like the spring, like in March or something. And September 11th obviously happened months later. The interesting thing though is Chris was approached by a gentleman, I don't remember his name, unfortunately. He was a writer and he worked in science fiction a lot. And I think he met Chris at maybe an event of some sort, but he approached him about being on the show. And I think Chris, told him to go through the different channels or whatnot. But he was very persistent. He would call in the office and I would be the one to take the call. And he would talk to me. And he was a nice guy. And I respect what he was doing. He was assertive, but not too much.
Right.
And he wanted to be on the show. And at one point he called up and said, and so again, this must be in 2000 or thereabouts. He said the CIA is doing a gathering of writers, of creative types. They're bringing them to the CIA to spitball like national threats to the country. And anything that you spitball with them, you're welcome as the writer to go off and write about, but they want to tap the creative person's mind about potential threats to the country. And he had, I believe, invited Chris and Frank, and neither was able to make it because I think they were in production on the projects. But the guy went, and because I remember he brought back and he gifted like a CIA windbreaker that he got when he was there. But I remember thinking, because the story was lightly touched on after September 11th, that I saw it in a few, because I was kind of looking for it. That did anybody note that the pilot of The Lone Gunman had a plane flying into the World Trade Center? It was done by remote control in the episode, so it wasn't exactly the same.
Right.
But the idea was, and I'm not suggesting that that's where they got the idea, but I always thought, like, what if Chris and Frank had gone to the CIA event and had mentioned, like, oh, by the way, we're writing this episode about, a plane flying into the World Trade Center? Because the timing of it, again, I think the episode, if it aired in the spring, then they were, working on it months in advance of that. And there was this potential to have been at the CIA spitballing threats. And I only, like I said, contemporaneously only saw a couple of articles that kind of drew any sort of odd connection to, like, this is odd that, a show had a similar, storyline of that. And I just, just always thought, like, what if,
Wow.
Prior to that, I guess Fox was having a problem with things being stolen from the lot, the equipment, whether it was like office equipment or studio equipment, I don't know, but they had security go through everybody's trunks as they were driving off the lot at night.
Okay.
And after September 11th, the security totally flipped to the other side, and they were checking everything coming in. And in fact, it was wild that they put up those K rails to enter, and they had like 4 levels of security. They had off-duty like sheriffs or LAPD, then they had like plainclothes, then they had studio security, they had dogs sniffing cars, and then there was like another layer of security beyond that. So it was crazy after September 11th where the studios changed. But then the weird thing was, somebody, I can't remember all the details of the story, but somehow there was somebody connected to somebody who had a housekeeper who was from like the Ukraine or something, and she loved the X-Files. And I think we gave her a tour, and then the next day she like showed up in the production offices just on her own. And this was after September 11th, after that security I just described. She somehow got on the lot and kind of freaked people out. But ridiculous, because at the time after that, there was a lot of worry about where would terrorists strike next. And apparently there was some chatter that was picked up that they might go after Hollywood. And, it's like, they're not going to go after film studio executives, but okay. We had another aggressive fan who would call in to talk to Chris frequently. And she was nice enough, but way too aggressive. And she would call at night when we weren't there and leave voicemail messages, lengthy voicemail, filling up our voicemail box, so that we had the studio change it from like unlimited voicemail recording or whatever, it was 4 minutes or something, to like 30-second max. to make it more difficult for her.
Right.
And she claimed that she had a dream that she saw Chris on Melrose, and she would call frequently. And at one point, I was like, we got information about her. We knew who she was. And I thought maybe they would approach her to tell her to knock it off, but they said it's actually not always a good idea to do that because sometimes that forces them to go another direction to get access. And again, she was kind of nice enough, but too aggressive. But one day, Chris always came in the office early. And generally, I would try to be in there as early as he was, but he would get in super early. And one day I had a dentist appointment first thing. So I was like an hour or two late getting to the office. And I came in and Chris said he picked up the phone, somebody called, and he told her to call back later. And like an hour or two later, the woman called and got me. And she was like, who was that picked up the phone earlier? He was so rude to me. And I didn't tell her, but she actually finally got him on the phone and didn't know it and thought he was rude. Bill Rowe used to throw these maybe he still does, I'm just not invited, but he'd have these Super Bowl parties at his house. It was out like in, I don't know, maybe Sherman Oaks or something out there where you actually have yards and things. He had a pool and he had a tennis court, basketball court, and he would just invite all these people from the show. And it was great because the people on the show would bring like big flat screen, they would know how to roll out a monitor on a stand, you know, and power it up. So there were TVs, big screen TVs everywhere.
Oh,
and at the time, my girlfriend at the time, she was the biggest fan of the show, biggest fan of Duchovny. Probably the reason she even started dating me was because of the connection with the show. But that's all right.
Once in a while, it's okay.
Yeah, she was great though. And at one point, I took her to the Super Bowl party, and Duchovny happened to be there. And she was a former All-American basketball player in high school.
Oh,
and
basketball.
We're walking around, and Duchovny is all by himself on the basketball court, just shooting some hoops. And she was like, you know, I could tell she wanted to play ball, and she, you know, I was like, I don't think I'd introduced her to him before, because also when I was on the show, Duchovny was suing Chris and Fox for the syndication rights of the show.
Yeah.
So Duchovny and I didn't, you know, spend a lot of time together as a result. But he's been very nice to me in the time since.
Right.
But at the time, I was like, she's a big fan. You know, introduced her, and I'm sure she, you know, she started playing with the ball a little bit. So then they started playing one-on-one. And she's not quite dressed to be playing one-on-one. She's just a little nice for it, but don't pass it. Because at the time he was living in Malibu, and he was just for recreation. I think he was scrimmaging against the women's basketball team at Pepperdine. You know, he would go up there and play on their courts, I think. I believe that's the case. But so she's playing with them, and I had him in camera. And at one point he goes to take a free throw shot, and she's like 6 foot tall. So she's pretty big on her own. And as he's taking his free throw, she just comes down with her hand to block the shot. And he's there, and she's coming up, and I caught the photograph at just the right moment. And it was like, I put it on a t-shirt for her, and he was using the initial D, you know, for Duchovny, and on the set. And I put D Nide, you know, D-Nide with the picture of her just stuffing the ball.
Oh, that's amazing.
It was the best gift. It was so much
fun. That is
a good time there, you know, and it's fun to remember them too, because it's been a while now. But